In this lesson, we're going to cover how to move between the various configuration levels using Server Manager, which could be local or remote, providing I have the management infrastructure installed to use Server Manager locally. So if I was running in server core mode, I would not be able to leverage Server Manager because there is no management infrastructure. We can use PowerShell to change our configuration level using the various install Windows feature and uninstall Windows feature PowerShell commandlets. And I can also use DISM, which is a command line utility that can be used to add and remove Windows components, patches, drivers to both online, i.e. our current operating system, and offline images. This is actually a very, very powerful tool for image and operating system management. So I'm going to quickly cover all three of these. So firstly, if I was actually using a graphical interface, as I previously demonstrated, I can go into Manage, Add Roles and Features. I would select that either local, my own box, or remote if it's running server core, or if I just want to manage it remotely, which is often going to be the case. I navigate to my features, and then I would select which graphical level I wanted to add, i.e. graphical management and tools, graphical shell, and likewise if I was removing, I would have this same menu and I would unselect options. I can also do this through PowerShell. So if I go locally to this box, I can open up PowerShell, and I can, for example, if I wanted to move to the server GUI management infrastructure, which is that minimal server interface, and then restart, and it's going to install that component. So I'm going to let that run. You'll notice the name of the component I specified, server GUI management infra, represents the name I have in the box, showing the component you have to add to go to minimal server interface. Likewise, if I wanted to go to the server with a GUI, I would have also added the feature server GUI shell. What this process is actually doing now is if I installed this server as server core, the graphical shell and the management tools would not have been copied to the local file system. So it would either be pulling this down from Windows Update using a feature known as Features on Demand, which I'm going to cover in a future lesson, or if you have a server configured to be used for the attainment of components, it would be pulling that from a local server. If I'd initially installed this box as a server with a GUI and then removed the GUI, but then added it back using this command, the files would already be on the server and it would just pull them from the side-by-side assembly store. So I'm going to let this finish. The reboot has now completed and I'm logging into that server. What you'll see is I still have a server core main interface, so it's a command prompt, but I'll also now have access to local management tools. This actual process, time-wise, will depend on your exact server. Obviously, if this is a server core installation, and this is the first time you've added the GUI and is pulling down the components from Windows Update, this may take 5 to 10 minutes depending on your internet connection. After that, it should be faster. So notice I've logged on, I have that command prompt, but I also have Server Manager, this automatically fired up. But I still have no taskbar. I have no system tray. What I additionally have now, as you can see, is Server Manager. I also have access to MMC console. I have access to more of the control panel applets. For example, the system control panel applet is now available. But I still do not have access to Explorer or Internet Explorer or any of those graphical shell components. One of the things I could now do though is I could manage my box locally using Server Manager. I could add and remove, for example, roles and features. So we're now in that middle configuration level, that minimal server interface. What I now want to do is actually move to a server with a GUI. Now I could do this with Server Manager. I could also do this once again with PowerShell, but I also wanted to show you the DISM option. So through DISM, I run the DISM command. Online means it's accessing this current operating system instance. I'm going to enable a feature. Now these names are actually slightly different from what we use in PowerShell. So the DISM is not something you would typically use. You're going to use PowerShell, you're going to use Server Manager. But it is good to know if you needed to perform this on an offline image, or maybe you were just prompted to say, how would you do this through the command prompt only and not through PowerShell, you would use the DISM command. So I'm enabling the server core full server and the server GUI shell. There's also the server-GUI-MGMT for the management, but I already have that installed. You can see it's now triggering the DISM tool, and it's going to add the graphical shell into this server. Once this process is complete, It will reboot, and then I'll have that full server with a GUI. I'll have the system tray, I'll have the taskbar, and the start screen. I should point out, and this question will come up, Windows Server 2012 does use the start screen. There is no start menu. There is no method to install the start menu. You use the start screen like you do in Windows 8. However, when I serve the installation when you log on, by default, it's actually going to go to the desktop. And one of the tips I like to use is to actually add Server Manager, and the tools I use the most, pin them down to the taskbar so they're always available. For example, on my Hyper-V server, I would pin Server Manager, my Hyper-V Manager, my PowerShell interfaces in Explorer to my taskbar by just right-clicking, and I've already got this pinned. But if I unpin it, if I launch the applications I want, I would just right-click and say pin this to the taskbar. It's then always available on my desktop, and I don't have to access the start screen at all. In reality, however, this becomes a much smaller issue because you are going to run your servers as server core anyway, or maybe minimal server interface. Very few of your servers will actually run as server with a GUI because of the additional patching, because of the additional potential reboots. So the fact that it's using a start screen is not something you're going to see, because as I'm going to cover in future lessons, you will actually manage this box remotely. So I'm going to say yes to reboot, and then when it's complete, I'll now be running a full server with a GUI. That process is now completed, the server is rebooted, and what you'll find in your environment is the move from, for example, server core to the minimal server interface takes significantly longer than moving from the minimal server interface to the server with a GUI. Obviously, you can go directly from server core to server with a GUI. The reason is, if you look at the content, the management infrastructure and the management tools represents 3 to 4 gigabytes of additional data copied to disk, whereas adding the graphical shell, Explorer and Internet Explorer, is only a few hundred megabytes. So certainly in terms of disk footprint, the management infrastructure and tools is the large part of the operating system. So this server is now complete. I'm now running server with a GUI, and I have access to all those graphical elements. I have my taskbar, my system tray, I have the balloon tips, and yes, I have the start screen. To move backwards through the configuration levels, it would be exactly the same process. I can say remove roles and features. I would select the server, I'm now running this locally, and I would just unselect the component I didn't want. Likewise, I could use PowerShell, and for example, I could say uninstall Windows feature, and I, for example, wanted to just uninstall the server GUI shell, but leave the management infrastructure, or I would actually like to go all the way back down to server core, so I would uninstall the server GUI management infrastructure as well, and then tell it to restart. I could also use DISM, and instead of doing enable dash feature, I would do disable dash feature. And that is then going to bring this server back down to server core level. This concludes the lesson on changing configuration levels.